Jane Canary, Cannary, better known as Calamity Jane, was an American frontierswoman and professional scout, known for her claim of being an acquaintance of Wild Bill Hickok, and fighting against Native Americans. Late in her life, she appeared in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and at the 1901 Pan-American Exposition. She is said to have always exhibited kindness and compassion to others, especially to the sick and needy. This facet of her character, contrasted with her daredevil ways, helped make her a noted frontier figure. She was also known for her habit of wearing men's attire. Early life. Much of the information about the early years of Calamity Jane's life comes from the autobiographical booklet she dictated in 1896, which was written for publicity purposes. She was about to begin a tour in which she would appear in dime museums around the United States, and the pamphlet was intended to help attract audiences. Some of the information in the pamphlet is exaggerated, or even completely inaccurate. Calamity Jane was born on May 1, 1852, as Martha Jane Canary in Princeton, within Mercer County, Missouri. Her parents, Robert W. and Charlotte Martha Cannary, were listed in the 1860 census as living about 7 miles further northeast of Princeton in Ravenna. Her father, Robert Wilson Cannary, had a gambling problem, and her mother, Charlotte M. Cannary, had spent time working as a prostitute. Martha Jane was the eldest of 6 children, having 2 brothers and 3 sisters. In 1865, Robert and his family moved by wagon train from Missouri to Virginia City, Montana. In 1866, Charlotte died along the way in Blackfoot, Montana, of pneumonia. After arriving in Virginia City in the spring of 1866, Robert took his 6 children on to Salt Lake City, Utah. They arrived in the summer, and Robert supposedly started farming on 40 acres of land. The family had only been in Salt Lake City for a year when he died in 1867. At age 14, Martha Jane took charge of her 5 younger siblings, loaded up the wagon once more, and took the family to Fort Bridger, Wyoming Territory, where they arrived in May 1868. For there, they traveled on the Union Pacific Railroad to Piedmont, Wyoming. In Piedmont, Martha Jane took whatever jobs she could find to provide for her large family. She worked as a dishwasher, cook, waitress, dance hall girl, nurse, and dock steam driver. Finally, in 1874, she found work as a scout at Fort Russell. During that time, Jane also began her on-and-off employment as a prostitute at the Fort Laramie 3-Mile Hog Ranch. In 1865, we emigrated from our homes in Missouri by the overland route to Virginia City, Montana, taking 5 months to make the journey. While on the way, the greater portion of my time was spent in hunting along with the men and hunters of the party. In fact, I was at all times with the men when there was excitement and adventures to be had. By the time we reached Virginia City, I was considered a remarkable good shot and a fearless rider for a girl of my age. I remember many occurrences on the journey from Missouri to Montana. Many times in crossing the mountains, the conditions of the trail were so bad that we frequently had to lower the wagons over ledges by hand with ropes, for they were so rough and rugged that horses were of no use. We also had many exciting times fording streams, for many of the streams in our way were noted for quicksands and boggy places where, unless we were very careful, we would have lost horses and all. Then we had many dangers to encounter in the way of streams swelling on account of heavy rains. On occasions of the kind, the men would usually select the best places to cross the streams. Myself, on more than one occasion, have mounted my pony and swam across the stream several times merely to amuse myself, and have had many narrow escapes from having both myself and pony washed away to certain death. But, as the pioneers of those days had plenty of courage, we overcame all obstacles and reached Virginia City in safety. Mother died at Blackfoot, Montana, 1866, where we buried her. I left Montana in spring of 1866 for Utah, arriving at Salt Lake City during the summer. Accounts from that period described Martha Jane as being extremely attractive and a pretty, dark-eyed girl. Martha Jane received little to no formal education and was illiterate. She moved on to a rougher, mostly outdoor, adventurous life on the Great Plains. Acquiring the nickname Martha Jane was involved in several campaigns in the long-running military conflicts with American Indians. Her unconfirmed claim was that it was during this campaign that I was christened Calamity Jane. It was on Goose Creek, Wyoming, where the town of Sheridan is now located. Captain Egan was in command of the post. We were ordered out to quell an uprising of the Indians, and were out for several days. Had numerous skirmishes during which 6 of the soldiers were killed and several severely wounded. When on returning to the post, we were ambushed about 1.5 miles from our destination. When fired upon, Captain Egan was shot. I was riding in advance and on hearing the firing turned in my saddle and saw the captain reeling in his saddle as though about to fall. I turned my horse and galloped back with all haste to his side and got there in time to catch him as he was falling. I lifted him onto my horse in front of me and succeeded in getting him safely to the fort. Captain Egan, on recovering, laughingly said, "I name you Calamity Jane, the heroine of the plains." I have borne that name up to the present time. As reported in the Anaconda Standard, Captain Jack Crawford, who served under both Generals Wesley Merritt and George Crook, stated that Calamity Jane never saw service in any capacity under either General Crook or General Miles. She never saw a lynching and never was in an Indian fight. She was simply a notorious character, dissolute and devilish, but possessed a generous streak which made her popular. It may be that she exaggerated, or completely fabricated, this story. Even during her lifetime, not everyone accepted her version as true. A popular belief is that she instead acquired it as a result of her warnings to men that to offend her was to court calamity. It appears possible that Jane was not part of her name until the nickname was coined for her. It is certain that she was known by that nickname by 1876, because the arrival of the Hickok wagon train was reported in the Deadwood newspaper, The Black Hills Pioneer, on July 15, 1876, with the headline, "Calamity Jane has arrived." Another unverified story in her autobiographical pamphlet is that in 1875, her detachment was ordered to the Big Horn River under General Crook, carrying important dispatches. She swam the Platte River and traveled 90 miles at top speed while wet and cold to deliver them. Afterwards, she became ill. Calamity said that after recuperating for a few weeks, she rode to Fort Laramie in Wyoming, and in July 1876, she joined a wagon train headed north. The second part of her story is verified. She was at Fort Laramie in July 1876, and did join a wagon train that included Wild Bill Hickok. That was where she first met Wild Bill Hickok, contrary to her later claims, and that was how she happened to come to Deadwood. Deadwood and Wild Bill Hickok. Calamity Jane accompanied the Newton Jenny Party into Rapid City in 1875, along with California Joe and Valentine McGillicuddy. By that time, her youthful good looks were gone. Her skin was leathery and tanned by sun and wind exposure on the high plains. She was muscular and masculine, and her hair was stringy and seldom washed. In 1876, Calamity Jane settled in the area of Deadwood, South Dakota, in the Black Hills. There, she became friends with, and was occasionally employed by, Dora DeFrange, the Black Hills' leading madam. She also became friendly with Wild Bill Hickok and Charlie Utter, having traveled with them to Deadwood in Utter's wagon train. Jane greatly admired Hickok. McCormick claimed on September 6, 1941, the U.S. Department of Public Welfare granted old age assistance to Jean Hickok Picard McCormick, who claimed to be the legal offspring of Martha Jane Canary and James Butler Hickok. After being presented with evidence that Calamity Jane and Wild Bill had married at Benson's Landing, Montana Territory, on September 25, 1873, the documentation was written in a Bible and presumably signed by 2 ministers and numerous witnesses. However, McCormick's claim has been vigorously challenged because of a variety of discrepancies. McCormick later published a book with letters purported to be from Calamity Jane to her daughter. In them, Calamity Jane says she had been married to Hickok and that Hickok was the father of McCormick, who was born September 25, 1873, and given up for adoption to a Captain Jim O'Neill and his wife. During the period when the alleged child was born, Calamity Jane was allegedly working as a scout for the Army, and at the time of Hickok's death, he had recently married Agnes Lake Thatcher. Although the father's identity is unknown, Calamity does seem to have had 2 daughters. In the late 1880s, she returned to Deadwood with a child she claimed was her daughter. At her request, a benefit was held in one of the theaters to raise money for her daughter's education in St. Martin's Academy at Sturgis, South Dakota, a nearby Catholic boarding school. The benefit raised a large sum. Calamity got drunk and spent a considerable portion of the money that same night and left with the child the next day. Esteline Bennett, who was living in Deadwood at the time and had spoken briefly with Calamity a few days before the benefit, thought Calamity honestly wanted her daughter to have an education and that the drunken binge was just an example of her inability to curb her impulses and carry through long-range plans. Bennett later heard that Calamity's daughter did in fact get an education and grew up and married well. After the death of Wild Bill Hickok, Jane also claimed that following Hickok's death she went after his murderer Jack McCall with a meat cleaver, since she had left her guns at her residence in the excitement of the moment. However, she never actually confronted McCall. Following McCall's execution for the capital crime, Jane continued living in the Deadwood area for some time, and at one point she helped save numerous passengers in an overland stagecoach by diverting several Plains Indians who were in pursuit of the vehicle. The stagecoach driver, John Slaughter, was killed during the pursuit, and Jane took over the reins and drove the stage on to its destination at Deadwood. In late 1876 or 1878, Jane nursed the victims of a smallpox epidemic in the Deadwood area. Final years. In 1881, Jane bought a ranch west of Miles City, Montana, along the Yellowstone River, where she kept an inn. After marrying the Texan Clinton Burke and moving to Boulder, she once again made an attempt in the inn business. In 1887, she gave birth to a daughter, Jane, who was adopted by foster parents. In 1893, Calamity Jane started to appear in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show as a storyteller. She also participated in the 1901 Pan-American Exposition. At the time, she was depressed and an alcoholic. Jane's addiction to liquor was evident even in her younger years. For example, on June 10, 1876, she rented a horse and buggy in Cheyenne for a roughly 1-mile joy ride to Fort Russell and back. But Calamity was so drunk that she passed right by her destination without noticing it and finally ended up about 90 miles away at Fort Laramie. death. In the spring of 1903, when Jane returned to the Black Hills brothel, Madame Dora de Fran was still running her business. For the next few months, Jane earned her keep by cooking and doing the laundry for Dora's brothel girls in Belfourche. In late July, Jane traveled by ore train to Terry, South Dakota, a small mining village near Deadwood. While staying at the Callaway Hotel on August 1, 1903, she died at the age of 51. It was reported that she had been drinking heavily while on board the train and became very sick to her stomach. The train's conductor carried her off the train. A bartender secured a room for her at the Callaway Hotel, and a doctor was summoned. She died almost immediately afterward, on Saturday, August 1, 1903, from inflammation of the bowels and pneumonia. Allegedly, found among her few belongings was a bundle of unsent letters to her daughter. Some of these letters were set to music in an art song cycle by 20th-century composer Libby Larsen called Songs from Letters. Calamity Jane was buried at Mount Moriah Cemetery, South Dakota, next to Wild Bill Hickok. 4 of the men who planned her funeral later stated that since Wild Bill Hickok had absolutely no use for Jane while he was alive, they decided to play a posthumous joke on Hickok by giving Calamity an eternal resting place by his side. Another account states, in compliance with Jane's dying requests, the Society of Black Hills Pioneers took charge of her funeral and burial in Mount Moriah Cemetery beside Wild Bill. Not just old friends but the morbidly curious and many who would not have acknowledged Calamity Jane when she was alive, overflowed the First Methodist Church for the funeral services on August 4 and followed the hearse up the steep winding road to Deadwood's Boot Hill. Additional information: Calamity Jane was a frequent visitor to and sometimes resident of Livingston, Montana and towns in the Paradise Valley, Montana. She came up from a very hard-scrabble life, unacquainted with bourgeois notions of decorum. She probably never knew financial security, but even in poverty she was known for her helpfulness, generosity, and willingness to undertake demanding and even dangerous tasks to help others. She was afflicted with alcoholism and wanderlust, but as someone remembered her, her vices were the wide-open sins of a wide-open country, the sort that never carried a hurt. Autobiography: Calamity Jane, as she eventually became known, lived a very colorful and eventful life but often claimed questionable associations of friendships with notable American Old West figures, almost always posthumously. For example, years after the death of Lt. Colonel George Armstrong Custer, she claimed that she served under him during her initial enlistment at Fort Russell, and that she also served under him during the Indian campaigns in Arizona. However, no records exist to show that Custer was assigned to Fort Russell, and he did not take an active part in the Arizona Indian campaigns. He was given the task of subjugating the Plains Indians. In 1896 she joined the traveling Coal and Amp Middleton Dime Museum as a performer, and a 7-page souvenir booklet was sold by that circus, titled The Life and Adventures of Calamity Jane by herself. It was almost certainly written by someone else, as there is no reliable evidence that Jane could read and write. The booklet misstates her birth name, her birth date, and misspells Missouri repeatedly. Several of the stories in the booklet are either unsupported or contradicted by reliable evidence. Unlike Annie Oakley, her performances did not involve sharpshooting or roping or riding, merely Jane appearing on stage in buckskins and reciting her adventures, which metastasized with each telling, in colorful but clean language. However, after about 6 months, her increasing drinking and profanity ended her career as a stage performer. Her reputation for embellishing her accomplishments, and the willingness of some others to attribute to her even more fanciful adventures, have made it very difficult to determine the true facts of her life. Historians historians have been unable to locate sufficient information to determine the truth about disputed events, and in many instances independent sources completely contradict her own accounts.